Welcome to the Star Chamber. I'm Ryan Swayze, a retired Air Force Lieutenant Colonel and the founder and president of the Walk the Talk Foundation, a nonprofit that advocates for and advises currently serving and former military service members going through the arduous journey of administrative processes and investigations in our government.
And I am Francesca Graham, a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel and the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisor for the Walk the Talk Foundation. For all our returning guests, welcome back. And for our new listeners, thank you for tuning in. Before we begin this week's topic, please do not forget to hit that subscribe button, check out our Walk the Talk Foundation website, and hit that donate button if you think we're doing a good job. Also, check out our newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, on all the socials, including LinkedIn, X, Instagram, and Facebook. Links in the description. All right, Star Chamber listeners, let's get started. Welcome back, Star Chamber listeners, to another awesome episode of the Star Chamber. And we are joined today by a guest that we're really excited about. I mean, let's get real. We're excited about all our guests. But this particular guest, she is not only awesome, but she also is the leader of the podcast that many of you, if you've listened to previous podcasts, have heard me reference, a podcast that Ryan was on last year, I think December 2024 timeframe. And they were talking about the psychology of the why in the military. Why does this nonsense happen in the military that we talk about all the time? And her name, and the podcast was called Military Culture Shift. You can still find that podcast online. And her name is Miss Corie Weathers. She is a licensed professional mental health clinician, and she is the author of a book that you can find on Amazon. You can find audio read by the author, Corie Weathers, and also digitally. And the title of that book is Military Culture Shift: The Impact of War, Money, and Generational Perspective on Morale, Retention, and Leadership. And before we get started, I just wanted to read a quick disclaimer that we normally read before we start these shows for all of our guests, because we have a lot of trust in the system. So the opinions and views expressed by the guests on this podcast are solely their own and do not represent the official policies, positions, or endorsements of the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or any other government entity. The discussion is intended for informational purposes only and should not be construed as reflecting the official stance of any military or governmental organization. Ryan, what do we say?
Oh, suck it,
Poindexters. Every time.
That's also mandatory.
Mandatory. Okay. So, Corie, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really, really excited to have this conversation. I had a wonderful conversation with Ryan. Goodness, I think I was still writing the book, Ryan, when we connected on LinkedIn. Yep. Had probably an hour and a half, 2-hour conversation about the psychology of things. And then just also getting to do that podcast interview with you. I'm really excited about today's conversation.
Oh, same. Me too.
So like you said, my name is Corie. I am a military spouse. I'm also a licensed professional counselor by trade. What that means is, my husband is in, and I've devoted a lot of my career to serving this population from a mental health perspective. At least that's how I started. And then as every military spouse navigates licensure, portability issues, at one point I had 5 licenses, trying to figure out what's in the best interest of my career. And also for my clients too, I had to be really creative. And so I really have taken that clinical side and zoomed out and really instead shifted towards studying the whole culture, studying the whole tribe, all branches, both the spouse culture, we'd call it a subculture, also the service member culture, and all of the dynamics that happen within this tribe psychologically. What motivates us, what demotivates us, what contributes to morale going up, what contributes to morale going down. And that led to a good 10 to 15 years of really studying from a boots on the ground perspective of what I was hearing behind confidential doors, all the way to traveling around and speaking to larger groups of, again, different branches, different ranks, and really understanding what are the biggest trends and issues that affect our culture, which led to writing the book Military Culture Shift. So as far as, when I get asked the question, what do you do? There's a lot of things I've had to figure out how to do as a spouse who gets to live in and work with this community. And I'm grateful. I know that what I get to do is privilege. There's a lot of spouses that really struggle, but it's been my honor to serve this community. And I think what you'll find, hopefully in our conversation today, is that we all, in addressing hard topics, which is also really a passion of mine, really comes from a place of loving this community and really valuing the people within and their reasons for serving in the first place and wanting to preserve their well-being, but also their souls and their mental health state so that they can end well. So thank you so much for the opportunity to join this conversation. And thank you guys for what you do on this podcast and your organization. It's so, so needed. And somebody has to be the one that's the voice for that. So thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I don't get giddy much, but I'm giddy for this show.
I can tell you are like bouncing over there.
Yeah, this is me in my energetic phase / state. It's amazing. Yeah.
So I caught you during a manic state, is what you're saying.
I don't know what that is, so no, I deny it. Yeah, where to even begin, Corie? It's so good to have you on the show. It's so good to talk to you again after what was an incredible, I think, interview now about a year and a half ago. And I want to hit on, first of all, something you said in your intro, which is we all do this for one thing. That's the betterment of the institution. And sometimes that gets misconstrued as, we're trying to burn the castle down or we're just counterculturists. It's exactly not. I mean, we all have lives, but we're all dedicated to the improvement of the military institution because, number one, we devoted a lot of time, most of our adult lives, to it. Number two, it's a necessity, right? The defense of the nation is critical. So thanks again for coming on. This is going to be a very long-winded question, but there's only going to be one question from me, maybe more. I don't know, but so you know about us, and you know about our aims and what the mission of the foundation is, and it centers about the whistleblower. The whistleblower is really defined as just a person who raises a concern of wrongdoing. That's all it boils down to in the most simplest of forms, right? And with that reporting comes bylaw protections, especially for members of the military. So I'm going to back it up. We were conferring on this article that Janet Reitman was writing about the Specialist Austin Valley case. I don't know if you're familiar with that. You are? Okay, good. So we were conferring. It's been about 2 years now, I think, is summer of 2023, Cheska, if my memory serves correctly.
Yep.
And the question that Janet had for us, she was completely flummoxed, and rightfully so, about how an Army unit could look at a kid, and he was a kid, essentially, like Austin, who was going through a lot emotionally, psychologically, and keep telling the commanders in the chain of command, we are 100% deployable, all in the green, all members ready to go, when Austin clearly was not. And the cognitive disconnect I think Janet was having, and I think most readers would have had, is how can a military institution that espouses the importance of resiliency, mental health, suicide prevention, can take a kid like Austin and go, you're having problems, we know, you are deployable, you are ready to go, when he clearly was not. Showing that the priority was greening up the slides or pencil whipping the numbers over the care of the individual, i.e. subordinate. So that's kind of where this psychological adventure for me really took a serious turn. And then over the years of the work of the foundation, 3 now in fact, I keep going back to this one question, and this is the one we're going to discuss, which is, you have a military, and okay, mental health resiliency aside, which is also important, but you have a military, which is a very large organization. As the head of it, I would want to know where my risks are. That's the genius of the whistleblower program, at least in theory, is that a person can say, this is bad, and they can do so without fear of retribution. Again, this is all in the academic sense. And you identify and hopefully curb that risk before it becomes a big deal. And in an organization like the military, it is a big deal. It's the defense of the nation. So with all these factors, the purported importance on resiliency, mental health, suicide prevention, the critical role, at least on paper, of a whistleblower, why is it that literally every case that we get follows seemingly the same pattern, which is the individual raises a concern of wrongdoing, whether they witness it or are a victim of it, and the institutions ingrained, like in their DNA ingrained, knee-jerk reaction is to gaslight, retaliate, reprise, and in all that, not vet the concern. So that's a very large and open-ended question, and intentionally so, because I want to know this answer, Corie. So what is it?
Well, and I don't mean this as a plug, but this is why I wrote the book, honestly, because I similarly was wrestling through all of these why questions, the questions you just brought up, the questions that I was seeing that were happening in counseling offices, or the dynamics happening in groups, or just even the big institutional, like, why would we choose to continue to put ourselves in global conflicts, even if globally that might be for good reason, but not address the very real risk of whether or not our force is ready or can handle another global conflict, right? And so all of these why questions took me down the rabbit hole of, well, let's look at all the variables. And I think that's part of the answer, is that there's so many contributing variables that our brains can't handle all the variables in an institution this big. And so we kind of numb out and scapegoat and like blame it on one thing over here, or blame it on one thing over here, when really it's these compounded variables altogether. And so we'll touch on a few of those today, but that's why it's also so hard to change, because it's a wicked problem of so many variables happening at once that you can try to address one issue, but then you have all these other ones that you don't maybe have the time or the expertise in to address. And then here is the spoiler alert. Like, I'm going to give you the upfront, like probably where we're going to end up, but don't turn, everybody listening, don't turn off, because you've got to like hear us unpack it all, right? But where we're inevitably going to end up, which is also sometimes very discouraging, but I think by the end of this conversation, it will be encouraging, is that really it comes down to the individual. It comes down to each person, each leader, each victim, each family member, each individual, on what they will choose to do with their situation, with their opportunity, with their influence, with their power, with their powerlessness, with their whatever. It ultimately comes down to this fundamental truth that we all know. We don't like it, but we all know it, which is, I can only control myself. And that is so freaking frustrating that we fight.
And I'm sorry to interject there, but what I always found fascinating throughout our professional military education curricula, from lieutenant through general officer, all our training, we never learn how to think and react, right? And we never learn about fallacies in our thought, fallacies in our logic, flaws in how we react, right? But a lot of this dynamic is by and large due to the fact that you just have people doing people things and people doing wrong people things, right?
Which brings up another really, and I am going to answer your question and unpack some of those variables, but what you're saying brings up another variable here of if we're going to bring about change, if we are going to address and do something different, then we end up having to wrestle individually and sometimes as a family with coming to terms with why do people choose destructive actions and behaviors, and what is it within them that would make that morally okay? And so whether it's in your family or in your marriage, or whether it's in your neighborhood, or whether it's in your state, or now whether it's in your country, or whether we see something happening globally. And I really do want to create that visual here, because in order to address the macro issue, you almost have to see it like a bullseye. And that when we're looking at larger systemic issues like the institution and what's happening institution-wide, sometimes the answers are to look at the inner ring and go, well, what's happening within the group? And then go even further. What's happening in that smaller tribe? And then now what's happening in me as an individual? And if I can create an understanding within myself of why I would do something, or where I could be tempted to do something, and what are my choices to do something different, then we're able to kind of go back outward again. So let me give you an example of that, because I'm not one of those people that believes in coincidences. Sometimes that's a fault of mine.
Same.
But
no, same.
This morning I was preparing for this conversation, and I listened to your podcast, but I wanted to kind of get in the zone and kind of really be thinking through our conversation and get my headspace ready. So I chose a random episode of your podcast to listen. And the one that I chose was the one you just brought up. No joke.
Perfect.
It was literally the story that you just shared. And I'm going to be very transparent here, because I want to, number one, model transparency and authenticity, which is a huge thing that we've got as an answer to a lot of this. So I want to model that, even though it's uncomfortable. And number two, I want to give the example of how I myself had to look at this within myself on an individual perspective and decide how was I going to practice this. So I actually this morning was driving back from my son's college. He's at Texas A&M, and I drove there last night to take him to a musical that we both love that happened to be happening at the college. It's like an hour and a half drive. And so I was driving back this morning. And so I have this hour and a half drive. I'm listening to your podcast, and I literally get 10 minutes into it. And that story that's so painful to hear, right? There's so many of these stories that are painful to hear of somebody that was struggling, and people either were unaware or didn't care. Which way is it? But either way, he was looked over, or he was dismissed, he was undervalued, or whatever. Now, this is very transparent for me to share. My son's probably not going to love this if he ever listens to this, but I got 10 minutes into the conversation and I had to pause the podcast, because what immediately came up in me is a conversation I had with my son last night, where I was listening and I was present and I was hearing him. And I could hear some of his concern of just struggling at college. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't until I was driving home, that listening to your story, that my mom red flags went off. And I went, you know what? If I go back and listen and think about that conversation, and here is one of the points: slow myself down, number one, and critically think. I was there, I was present, I heard it. But did I critically think through what he was saying to me? And that's one of the things that we are struggling with in society right now, is that we are not slowing down, and we have forgotten how to critically think, or we're not giving ourselves time to critically think. And we're seeing Jonathan Haidt really point out in his advocacy to take cell phones away from students and Gen Z, that they are just now having to go through the very painful, hard work of learning to read books again. Because we're so used to scanning information, we can't slow down long enough to critically think through and read a whole chapter, much less a book. And so I gave myself a second to pause and critically think through the conversation. And once I did, I was like, I need to reach out to him, and I need to have a more authentic conversation with him, and really genuinely say, hey, are you okay? I know you kind of brushed it off yesterday, but I think actually when I think back on it, there was a couple things that we need to talk deeper about. And I think that, and that turns out like my spidey senses were right. Like he did need to talk more. He did need to have a connection point. So my point here is one of the issues that we're having right now is as a society, as a culture, we're not paying attention. There are a whole bunch of other variables that are happening. There's things like you cover this on your podcast, things like self-preservation. There is the idea of insecurity. And if leaders are insecure, then they're less likely to accept mistakes, accept people not being ready, because it might reveal their own mistakes. I have seen that happen personally as I've seen leaders who choose, instead of to protect the victim, they chose self-preservation because it would have exposed their own mistakes. So there's all these variables of reasons of why not only individuals, but why a whole institution would choose these other routes. And most of the time I can narrow it down to power and the temptation for power. Mm-hmm. Some people want to simmer it down to we're all motivated by love and fear. And I agree with that. But if we actually change some of those words, I would say we are tempted with power more than ever. And that includes influence. It includes notoriety. It includes fame. It includes whatever that gives you that meets a need. And so usually power comes from a place of need. And it can be a legitimate need, a need for financial security. But it also can be a destructive need, which is I feel insecure and I feel better about myself when I have power or I'm aligned with power. And then we're also motivated by fear, and that's a huge part of it. But I want to add a third one as of this morning, as I had this experience, which is I think now more than ever, it's not just love or fear. It's not just power or fear. I think it's also distraction. I think it's an element of numbing out because we are so oversaturated. I had this phrase that popped in, and I'll love for you guys to respond. I had this phrase that popped in my head while I'm driving down the road, which was, if we care too much about everything, we care about nothing. And we have become so over-concerned with so many things and oversaturated with so much of the world that we care less about the things that actually matter. Pair that with a lack of critical thinking. And just like I did as a mom, I skimmed over something and wasn't able to be present and actually see what was right in front of me.
Yeah, that was something that last thing you just now said about caring about everything means you care about nothing. That's something that was brought up when I was at a conference last year about the response of congressional staffers when we bring things to them, which is this idea that I hadn't heard before of compassion fatigue. Is they have so many things, so many issues that are brought to them that they reach a certain point where they just can't care anymore about the next thing.
Yeah. And I would add information fatigue now to that, because I think that we are far less compassionate as a society than we've ever been, and we're more information fatigued than anything else. And Brian, I do want to address what you said about the way that, because I'm hearing this from other leaders. I've heard it from several leaders confidentially, their struggle now. And I see this as an encouraging dilemma that I'm hearing them in, because they're actually vocalizing it and talking about it and wrestling with what to do about it, which is exactly the scenario that you brought up, which was in the past, leaders would lie in order to say that their unit, their group, whatever branch we're talking about was greenlit or ready or was, combat ready, right? But now I'm hearing from so many leaders that it is in order to make sure that they're ready, the level of effort relationally that it is taking them to do everything from checking on their people to teaching Gen Z the life skills that they need to be psychologically, emotionally ready, developmentally ready. I've heard from leaders where they're spending an hour to an hour and a half every week having meetings, teaching life skills on what to do if you get a speeding ticket, what to do if you have conflict in your home, what to do, and having roundtable discussions on what are the practical strategies, life skills to deal with that. And his understandable frustration, he was Gen X, by the way, his understandable frustration of, I can't do both. I can't invest in the people the way that they're needing me to invest in them as human beings and also be combat ready. And my response to him, which is my response to many of them, is we now find ourselves in a moral and an ethical dilemma. Will you lie for the sake of self-preservation? Or will you choose to push back? And that means to push back going up and saying, I can't do what you're asking me to do. And you up there are going to have to now, I'm going to hand over this moral or ethical dilemma to you to decide how you will handle this ethical dilemma and pass that up. And you will have to decide, are we ready to go to war or not? And that has to go up the chain. And we've been afraid to do that until more recently. And now we have leaders, mostly millennial, that the number one word I'm getting from them is they feel sandwiched. And they feel exhausted in that being sandwiched between these different generations and finding themselves in that stuck place. And that's why we're seeing a mass exodus.
Yeah, and I agree. We got a lot to unpack from your answer. I got a few follow-up questions, so I guess I won't. I guess I'll have more than one question this show. But this thing of leaders pushing back up the chain to stand up for what's right, despite it might not be popular, is what I would term moral courage. Yeah. And I submit to you that, God's honest truth, I'm not trying to be cynical, we have been lacking in that. Yeah. It's always kind of ironic, isn't it? Because we've just spent 20 years at war where a lot of people demonstrate a lot of courage on the battlefield, only to come home and not demonstrate moral courage needed to lead well. That's my 2 cents. There are two aspects you brought up that I want to talk to a little bit further as it pertains to the whistleblower leadership relationship / tension, and that's the first two factors of power and fear. I submit to you two things, and you tell me your thoughts. For power, and the power and fear actually kind of go together, so I'll talk to that one first. I see the institution and the leadership of the institution's reaction to a whistleblower, a complainant, a victim, raising a question, raising an issue of wrongdoing, being perceived to question the sanctity of command. And from a psychological standpoint, I feel like the reaction is in line with that. Like the leadership is not taking it as a person who's identifying risk, i.e. helping the organization, but instead questioning those who are running it. The second vignette I'd like to provide is about power as it pertains to leadership and their ability to influence good and bad. I think there's a huge disparity in military leadership, especially at mid-level leadership, talking colonel, younger general officer type level, a huge disparity in what good you can do and what bad you can do. In terms of improving and providing for the good of an individual, there's very little actually you can do. You can't go, you're promoted. It doesn't work like that. Mm-hmm. You go, you're going here. It doesn't work like that. There's very little direct positive influence. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can have positive influence, of course, mentor and guide and be a role model. But in terms of the bam, voila, you've got something good, there's very little an officer, especially a leader, can do. Mm-hmm. But in bad, I mean, look at the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the administrative process. There is a lot of bad stuff you can affect tomorrow. Mm-hmm. And if you're looking to show that you can wield power, mm-hmm. the bad stuff is far easier and you have far more latitude, unchecked latitude. So those are my two thoughts. I toss it back over to you for your counter thoughts.
No, first of all, I agree that what I hear you saying is that fear is a much easier and unfortunately a much more effective means of motivating people than love or kindness or reward is. Reward, thinking through, I mean, I'm using these examples not to, please nobody take offense at this, but like dumb it down. But sometimes we have to take something so complex and see that it's actually in our everyday world and it helps us make sense of it, right? And so when you think about parenting a toddler, right? It's so much easier to punish than it is to like figure out what the heck like the reward is going to be that's going to help them potty train. Like, and I'm not saying that our adults and our service members are toddlers. Please don't hear me say that. But when it comes to how do we motivate people, even we as parents, all of us as parents struggle with, we tend to err on the side of discipline, then err on the side of trying to motivate through reward, kindness, affirmation. We see a whole generation like tried that through, let's say, helicopter parenting, and we see the extremes of both sides, right? So when you zoom out to a whole institution, you can understand like if we're all just going to hit a lazy, easy button, it is so much easier to motivate people with fear. And that also means if you're on the receiving end of that constant punishment or that motivation of fear, which even our family has very much struggled with and felt with on occasion. Now at 17 years, I think we've gained enough maturity and experience to go, you know what, this is not cool anymore. And we actually have the ability to decide for ourselves what we will do with the institution's use of punishment or use of intimidation, and who will we be? How will we be? What will our response be? What is our personal choice? And so that takes time and I think developmental maturation to figure out that. But I think you're right. Like it is so much easier. And to do the opposite, which there's so much research that shows reward is more effective than punishment. Like a million times we all know this, but then you have to ask the question, well, why don't we do it? Because it takes more effort right. and energy. In fact, that's the number one thing I end up saying in a lot of the workshops that I'm doing is as we start to wrestle with these questions, I usually end up having to say, look, I know that we all just want this to be easier. We need our jobs to be easier. We want to come to work. Our home life is hard enough. We're regulating, we're parenting, we're trying to figure out how to keep our marriages intact and thriving and whatever. And then we get to work and we just want somebody else to come to work and do their job. Can you just do your job? I'm doing my job. Can you just do your job? And so we want to hit an easy button. But any environment that involves people equals relationships, and relationships are hard and relationships are messy. And the only answer, if you want things to get better, is to step into the messiness of it getting harder and working harder. And even though we're exhausted, you have to decide, what do you value most? Easy and cheap and loneliness and the emptiness that power brings, because it is empty. And you'll eventually gain that influence only to realize there's no one to share it with and that everybody dislikes being in your circle of influence. Or you can choose the harder route and end better with community and trust and all that effort to show for something. So the last thing, I'll just kind of respond to your first question, which I barely remember now, but I will say,
Same.
I remember thinking while you were saying it, that really I liken it to a marriage conversation. Like in marriage, we struggle with the defensiveness of when somebody brings us, because you were bringing up the whistleblower to institution or whistleblower to leader dilemma of when a whistleblower is trying to say, hey, there's areas for growth here. There is risk here. I'm willing to be vulnerable and put my own story out there because I care about my healing. I care about institutional healing, and I care about other people too. And I am challenging you to be an adult with me and us grow together because we made a commitment and an agreement that that's what we both believed in. So I'm putting my cards on the table and saying, okay, you said we could, so I'm bringing this to you and I'm making myself vulnerable, trusting that you're going to do it with me. And most marriage disagreements are very similar, right? We make ourselves vulnerable and the other person goes, why are you attacking me? Like, it's not my fault, right? And so what do? We get defensive. We throw it back at them. All kinds of things, again, for all the same reasons, out of self-preservation, out of insecurity, out of our own mistakes being revealed, out of those things being used as ammunition later. And we can boil all of that down to pride or shame, which I always say they're both flip sides of the same coin. Either you're thinking too highly of yourself or you're thinking too lowly of yourself, but either way, you're thinking too much of yourself.
So let's use the divorce parallel or the riff in a marriage as it pertains, or the parallel to whistleblower vis-a-vis leadership. What's, if you're queen for the day and you're tasked with at least starting to try and repair this system, which is not working. I mean, we can say that as a matter of fact, because in large part of this dynamic of a whistleblower complainant victim goes, this person is in the wrong, and maybe this person is the commander, and then it goes defensive, and the line in the sand is drawn, and people choose sides. It's over. It's really over before it starts. If we're using that kind of relationship parallel, you're queen of the military, and I would vote for you, by the way, for queen of the military. What's one thing real, substantive, we could institute within the realm of possible that could help kind of repair this very broken relationship?
Would anybody want to be queen of something like that? I don't think so.
No, that's why I voted for you.
But here's that temptation for power, right? Sounds great. So first of all, I'm terrible at giving black and white answers because, again, relationships are messy. And so you're never going to hear me just go, well, this is what I do, because it's always messier than that. And I think that there's truthfulness and integrity, meaning not integrity meaning right, but integrity in like whole and more reliable, and in the messiness of there not being a concrete answer. So I just want to give a quick caveat to say, even though we're using and simplifying this down to a marriage relationship or a parenting relationship or whatever, please, those of you listening, hear me say that there are so many other massive, big other variables going on, such as what are our adversaries seeing and our allies seeing in our decisions as an institution? And that's where we do get into a matter of national security. And so there's a lot of very big, even historical reasons why we make the decisions that we do. And historically, we have been an institution that shows no cracks, and that and that was just as much of a message that in an identity that we needed to show our nation and to those that we were leading, that we could be an institution that was strong and that was effective and that was lethal and that was successful. And we needed our people our tribe to understand that. We needed our nation to understand that, to get behind it and support it. But we also needed to send those messages globally. And so that's where the complexity of this comes in, that the reasons why we have defensiveness and self-preservation on an institutional level, there is varied. And there's a lot of plates spinning as to all those contributing factors, even when you talk about congressional support and which each of those representatives not only support, but what their constituents think. And some of the things, and this is something I have to tell myself a lot, even if I was queen for a day. I think if I would, number one, tell myself, I always have to assume that there's something I do not know and I do not understand. That I am not a God. I cannot be an all-knowing person. And so I need to be somebody that goes and asks questions and makes sure that I'm open to what I don't understand. And that would be my number one thing, is we have to be willing to go, what do I not understand above me and echelons above me, but also what am I not tracking and understanding with boots on the ground? So I want to give that caveat first here, is that even though we're simplifying this down, this is very complex. But going back to the relationship, I think that just like in a marriage, in any kind of relationship, and I say this all the time in my advocacy with the institution on mental health care and our TRICARE contracts we're currently going through. I know this is probably coming out hopefully when it's resolved, but it seems like it's never fully resolved, which is the TRICARE system and the contracts that are a mess right now. And that's a recent thing that I have not stormed the gates, but really been an advocate to go, hey, here's the deal. Representatives from DHA and TriWest and Humana, our contractors with TRICARE, need to film a video of themselves, the three of them together, and we just need to say, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. That's where you start in a marriage conflict. That's where you start in a family conflict. That's where you start if you're in a community where something has gone wrong. That's where you start on an institutional level as well. And so, while using that example, while we saw a letter that came out that said, we are aware of issues and here is what we can tell you will happen, there was never an expression that said that this relationship between you and I is worthy of repair. And that is the number one thing that we have to do. There's all the practical of all the steps and all the legal things that we've got to figure out. But number one, the number one thing that I think across the board, if I was queen for the day, we have to know how to articulate and communicate that you, as a person, regardless if you're a whistleblower or whether you're bringing me tough things that I don't want to hear, or whether you are the hero, either way, you are worthy of repair in this relationship. And I'm going to humble myself to say, because you are worthy, I can say, I am so sorry for what you have gone through, that I would never wish that on anyone, that it was not okay for you to experience what you experienced. And I may not be able to solve it all or fix it all, but I can tell you that I'm sorry it happened and I'm here to listen. That's a start.
I love it. I love it. And Jessica, I'm going to yield the floor to you in a second here for your question. I'm sorry to interject. I love that answer. I think you're spot on, Corie. I think the trouble is, I mean, let's play a 1 second game. Name a general officer, senior officer in the last 5 years that's gotten up on a podium and apologized on behalf of the institution for something. I can't name one. I think the first critical step goes against the very DNA of the general flag officer corps of the military, which is never to admit culpability or fault. I think that's where we're really at an impasse on. Okay, Jessica, sorry, go ahead.
Well, if I could pick up on that point, and then I'll ask my question, which is kind of a paradox, what you're saying, though, Ryan and Corie, because the general officers, admirals, are not going to admit fault. And the reason they're not going to admit fault, I'm guessing, is because their JAG has told them, say nothing, do not admit fault anywhere.
It's true. Yeah, we laugh, but it's true, right?
But the paradox is that why are they even saying that? We can't sue anyways. So what do you got to lose? Right? The Ferris Doctrine makes it so you can't. Ryan's laughing over there really hard for those of you who can't hear him because you can't see it. But it's like you can't sue, so what do you got to lose, right? It's not like, you know. So the question I had though was tossing back a little bit to Ryan's comment about moral courage, that it takes moral courage to be able to say, no, this is not, we don't have the time, we don't have the people, we can't actually do all the things you're telling us to do. And the question I have is from your studies of the military population, at what point, if you've thought about that, at what point do people lose that moral courage? And so there's the question behind that, which is that, you know, I remember as a lieutenant, I would say, no, we can't do this. And I got beat down and told, no, you're going to. I remember as a captain, no, we can't do this. I got beat down, told, no, you're going to do it. As a major, I said the same thing. As a lieutenant colonel, I said the same thing. And obviously I'm retired now. But, you know, so there, and I was thinking as you were talking, I went on Google because I remembered at West Point, every single one of us were issued a book called A Message to Garcia. And every unit that I was ever in, we were always issued this book called A Message to Garcia. It was written in 1898, and just the Google AI says the phrase to carry a message to Garcia is a metaphor for taking initiative and demonstrating unwavering loyalty and determination in one's work. It initiates from this book, A Message to Garcia. And what we were, the Stockholm Syndrome, the indoctrination that we as cadets at West Point and then throughout my military career were given from that book is don't push back, figure it out. And when you push back and you demonstrate that quote unquote moral courage, it's not actual moral courage, it's you can't handle it. So where does that stop? So we're indoctrinated in this, if you push back, it means you can't handle it, you can't figure out how to manage all your resources, all these different things. So when do people actually stop doing that? And also, even if maybe Ryan or you could answer this, is what are the most important ranks, I guess, or positions within the military who have to, no crap, have that moral courage so that all the young kids who are going to change the world and they're full of all this energy and are going to call BS all over the place know that that's okay.
Oh, I love this question so much. And one of the first phone conversations Ryan and I had, I shared with him a metaphor that I was like, I can't put this out in the world. I would get crucified for it. And I alluded to it in the book. I didn't say it outright because it is a little bit dangerous to say. But again, hopefully people listening here understand by now that I use these metaphors to just help you see the patterns, that's what I really love to do, is study patterns in people groups. Why do people behave the way that they do? Why do they make the choices that they do? To your question, what makes people give up? What makes people shift, right? And so I won't go into the metaphor at length, but I want to answer that question by, I'll first answer it and then I'll kind of put it in the narrative and put it in the metaphor. I think, and I would have to do some more thinking on this to give you a more educated answer on it, but from my clinical experience and from watching the culture, I would say the point that you're asking is the moment where the individual adopts the narrative that they are being told as their own, adopts it as their identity.
Oh, perfect. It's really good.
And what I mean by that is, let's use, again, a marriage relationship, okay? Just so that we can understand, but be thinking about the institution and its people. When you are in a marriage relationship, and if there is domestic violence in that relationship, we all know, most of us know, the cyclical pattern of a domestic violence relationship. There's grooming, there is I can give you the world, and then there is jealousy usually, there's violence, then there's the apologetic behavior, then we go back into a honeymoon and we start all over, right? And all of us would go, why would anyone stay? If we know the patterns and if we know the cycle, and I've worked with domestic violence victims, they know the cycle. They can map it out better than I can map it out. You know, for every clinician that's worked with a domestic violence victim, you go, why are you staying? Right? On the outside, it's very easy to say that. And I will never forget a military spouse that I was working with that was in a domestic violence relationship. And this was the beginning of like a major light bulb moment for me. And the start of studying the culture really was when she said to me, what am I going to do? If I leave my service member, I will be considered the most unpatriotic person to everybody else, which leans to a whole other conversation about hero worship, right? Never mind his character, right? But that nobody would understand. This person went to war and he did all of these things. And she also was saying, not only will people not understand why I would leave the soldier, but also I have nothing. We hear that all the time, right? I have nothing. I feel trapped. I don't have a job. I don't have medical care. I don't have all these things. And so the next point, and you can still hear in her explanation that there's still a bit of moral courage in there. And so if we unpack what is moral courage, well, there's two words, morals. And that implies that we know what our morals are. We own our morals. We as an individual decide what our morals are, that we rank our values, and that we determine what is right and wrong to us. And we are aware of that. And because we are aware of it, then when there is something that goes against our morals, we are willing to do something about that, because we cannot live with ourselves and hold those morals at the same time as we do nothing. Right? So that courage makes you do something based off of these foundational morals that govern everything about your life. So where would somebody lose their moral courage? Well, something has to shift on the inside where this narrative, going back to that domestic violence relationship, if the victim eventually adopts the narrative, the lies or the things that the abuser is saying to them, and they start believing them, they adopt the narrative and change their view of their identity. Now their morals shift. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
once a
Perfect
person
sense. Yep.
starts to say, you know what, it's not you, it must be me. So when
Mm-hmm.
you say, well, why didn't you work harder? Or why didn't you fix it? Or why didn't you figure out whatever that phrase was, right? It's a shaming message. It's like you could
Mm-hmm.
have done something. You could have done something different. Why didn't you, right? And so all these messages that it's you, that it's you, that it's you, there's still moral courage to go, wait a minute, something's wrong about what you're saying. It's not just me, it's also you. Right. And I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking you to do what you said you would do and what you asked me to do, which was that we could both come to the table and evaluate this relationship and want it to grow. And so when I do that, you're saying it's all me. But something in me says that's wrong. And so I'm going to have the courage to challenge you on that. But when you again and again and again go through this cycle of it's not me, it's you, it's not me, it's you,
Mm-hmm.
eventually somebody goes, maybe it's me. And that's the moment
Yeah.
that their morals shift and they adopt a different narrative. And now we've lost them
Mm-hmm.
because now it's a war with self. And now we are believing that we actually are a victim instead of I'm not a victim, I'm an advocate, or I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor, or I'm not a victim, I am one that brings hope and brings purpose from my story. Like that's where we shift.
It's fascinating because, Cheska, how many times have we seen that pattern play
Mm-hmm.
out in a whistleblower's
Yep.
journey? Go, I saw what was wrong. I reported it because you told me to. And then they begin that sequence of events that Corie just described. And a lot of them in the end conform to basically reflect what the institution has been telling them,
Yep.
saying you did wrong by doing right.
Yep.
And those people then grow up in the
Which
ranks.
this leads to going back to something Ryan brought up earlier, which I think is also very important. And it's going to sound like I'm pushing back a little bit for a second, but just go with me on this, that there have been maybe less publicized examples of leaders trying to be that empathic voice, to be the person that says, I'm sorry. I wrote about in the book that there was, during the mold crisis, there was a general that was walking around that said, I want to hear your story. And you may think you have told your story, but you haven't said it to me. You know, and there's these examples of people trying to be empathic. But the real question is, there's two questions. One, if somebody did say they were sorry, if a leader did say, you are worthy of repair and I want to fix it, which I do think that we could do better in how we communicate it and how we choose our words, we could do better at
Mm-hmm.
that. If they did, what keeps us from hearing it and receiving it? Because I also see that happening. I see some people trying, but there is a massive wave of pushback of it's not good enough. It's not enough. You're not doing this other thing, right? And so I have to challenge some of us that when we do hear people trying to do the right thing, does it count for something? Because if you go back to a marriage relationship, if you are in a lockdown argument and you're paralyzed in your argument, and finally somebody says, all right, I'm sorry. I really am. I'm sorry. We could choose to stay in that conflict and go, I don't believe you. It's not good enough. You know, you got to say it a different way. Or we can humble ourselves to go, it's a beginning. So that's number one. But to our other point, if we are in such a cyclical relationship where the voices that might come across that we are now just in a honeymoon stage, and I don't believe you because I've been in this cyclical pattern for so long that I don't trust you, then that can be a reason of why we don't receive it. And that makes us have to have a different conversation of how do you rebuild trust? Because we've talked about communication and we've talked about what helps us actually receive communication and motivate ourselves into action. But rebuilding trust takes time. Rebuilding trust is do the right thing for the right reason for a really long time.
I love it. And I'd like to, unfortunately, wrap up the show, but I want to talk about the first part of that answer, Corie, which is, again, in the relationship of the whistleblower scheme, the complainant slash victim being receptive to leadership, inspectors general, whatever, actually trying to do the right thing, actually acting in good faith. Would you agree a key element of that could be, and one of the things I think we see lacking a lot of times from the inspector general system, from the institution, is transparency. I believe, and this is my optimistic yellow self now, I believe there are a lot of leaders and there are quite a few inspectors general that are out there trying to do the right thing, trying to investigate, trying to vet fully, but are so opaque you wouldn't know it. So all you can do is revert to that, what you do know, and that is the system's not to be trusted. Would you buy that?
Yeah. And when we talk about rebuilding trust after a betrayal, transparency is, well, the first thing that has to stop it. The first thing that has to happen is the behavior that's destructive has to stop. We cannot move forward until the behavior has stopped. The abuse has stopped. The destructiveness has stopped. Number one. Number two, now we go into full transparency. Everything on the table, because you cannot rebuild trust if there's that opaque, right? If there's that, because the person who's been wounded that feels betrayed already knows that you are able and willing to wound, to betray. And so their biggest fear is to be made a fool in their vulnerability. And so the only way to create safety and security is for the person who did the wounding. And I understand that there's people in the system that are trying to, let's say, investigate or be part of the system that weren't the wounders, but they are part of the institution that did the wounding. And so you almost have to be like on behalf of the institution, even though I myself did not do that. I know that I represent that. And I hold a lot of power because what I do, you have to, if you think about it as a scale, the power is so heavy on the institution side and not on the victim side. The only way to rebuild trust is to counterbalance that scale, right? And so the way that we give a little bit more power to at least equalize things out is by being transparent and saying you, the victim, has more power and control on the process, on how you were treated, on the documents that you need, to the point of your that podcast that I was listening to earlier, right? That when you say I want to see my paperwork, that it's not redacted, right? When I need to see the man behind the curtain, that you are fully transparent, and that shifts some of the power back to the victim. But when you have a victim that's not getting all of the information, all the quote receipts, if I was working with a couple where there was an affair, we go through the same process where the victim or the wounded spouse gets to say, here is how you rebuild trust for me for a certain period of time, not forever, but for a certain phase of this recovery, where if I, as the wounded spouse, need to see the receipts that you actually did go to the grocery store, instead of who knows where, that you're bringing the receipt home, and that's transparency that you were where you said you were, right? But that wounded spouse gets to be the person that defines that transparency. And that gives them that power to know that the other entity is trying to rebuild trust. Without that arrangement, then we still have so much power on the wounding, entity's side, that the victim is still going to be vulnerable and feel like another hurt is around the corner.
Yes. Brilliant. Love it. That hour went super
fast.
As I knew it would.
Unfortunately fast. And I know I have about 7 more questions I want to ask.
Okay, would you be okay if I just say something in closing? And then if you guys want to close,
do.
I feel like it's really important because we have addressed a lot of heavy topics here. And I also understand that there might be people listening that even some of the metaphors that I used could bring up a lot of personal feelings for you as well, depending on what's going on in your own life. And so thank you for letting me use those metaphors and your gracefulness and understanding why I chose to use them. But I think that maybe to wrap up, I think what's really important here, I know a lot of what we're trying to pursue all of us here is, how do we fix things? How do we shift things? How do we heal people? How do we do all these things for the greater good of people and the institution? And we've talked about the importance of the individual's ability to choose and their autonomy of choice. But I just want to say, here's the deal. If I go back to that conversation with that I had with my son, or any of the victims that you guys have worked with, or any of the people that I work with one-on-one, there is the importance of telling your story. There is the importance. It is deeply important to your character and your healing for you to find your moral courage and keep your moral courage. But the moral courage to not isolate is the most important, powerful next step that determines everything. Because the second that you adopt the narrative that it's all you isolate, and that's where you do not have enough strength. None of us have enough strength on our own to fight the lies inside ourselves. Mm-hmm. The next step of moral courage is just telling your story or reaching out to the circle around you so that you can reach out and say, you know what, I'm struggling today. Or this is unfair, or this was deeply hurtful, or I'm going through a season of immense grief. Whatever it is that you're going through, it is sharing your story with a trusted group of people that validate, that see you, that hear you, regardless of what happens, regardless of what institutions change, regardless of what happens with that investigation. At the end of the day, at the end of our life and career, it will be the circle of people that are around you that you trust, that walked with you through that story and are still there and are still present. And so the people around you are everything, whether it's professional help or support and just having people hear your story. So I think that would be my just kind of final wrap up, is make sure that you keep in mind what is most important. And that is connectivity, community, shared experiences, and sharing your suffering. Everyone is suffering. Everybody has suffered. And there's plenty of research that shows suffering develops community. If we don't share it, we're going to get further isolated, and that's dangerous. So thank you guys so much for letting me join you and go as deep as we did. Again, I could do this for hours, so thank you.
Same. I couldn't have wrapped it up any better. So I leave the last word to Cheska.
Well, I think I'm about the same as you, Ryan. And Corie, thank you again so much for joining the podcast.
That was awesome.
It was awesome. I'm sure everyone has a billion questions. If you do have a billion questions and you want some more advice or need some more thoughts, shoot us a note. Our emails are up on the website, or come onto the website and fill out a form and get in contact with us. And we would love to talk more about this. All right, everyone.
All right, until next episode.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, that's it for this week's topic. We really appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out our foundation website at walkthetalkfoundation.org.
And feel free to reach out and give us feedback. You can get a hold of us via Facebook, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, and our foundation's website. Details in the description section. Thanks for tuning in, and see you next episode.